Greetings from Tokyo. My name is Daisuke Beppu. How are you doing today? I hope all of you are doing well. Today I'd like to talk about another film in the Criterion collection. This is Spine number 8, and this is The Killer. This is a film that is a Hong Kong action film from 1989, directed by a gentleman whose name is John Woo. It's a cops and robbers film. It's a gangster film. It's a film about a killer, hence the title. It's about a film, it's about a killer that is hired by the mob or the gangsters or the triads essentially to carry out these killings of certain people. And on one of these missions or jobs, he accidentally injures a young innocent bystander, Jenny, and she loses her eyesight. And so therefore the film is essentially about this killer whose name is John or Ajan, and he is trying to basically make amends for the harm that he has caused this woman. So this is a DVD, and this is unfortunately out of print as of the time of this recording of this video. But let me just tell you what's on this Criterion collection release. So this is the DVD, which also features the commentary by John Woo and production executive Terrence Chang. There are also deleted scenes and also a theatrical trailer. And this is, I should say, the 110-minute version of the film. Let me now talk to you about this wonderful film, but if you haven't seen it, I suggest that you stop this video right now and watch the film, and then you can come back to this video at any time. I'll still be here. And I will talk about some details of this film, so I don't want to spoil it for you. So again, if you haven't seen it, I strongly urge you just to stop the video and watch the film and then come back at your leisure. I must warn you, however, that the film is rather violent, and there's a lot of there is quite a great deal of blood and violence. So if that's not your cup of tea, then perhaps this film might not necessarily be for you, which is perfectly fine as well. But I think you should just be warned. There is a certain level of intense violence that occurs. Okay. So now that you're here, I'm assuming that you have seen the film or you don't mind being spoiled. In which case, let us talk about this really wonderful and memorable film. There is so much to digest here. There is so much going on here, I think, that makes the film much more of an engaging and fascinating film than meets the eye. On its surface, of course, it is an action film filled with razzle-dazzle, just wonderful, how should I put it, almost pop entertainment. And it has a certain elevated stylized rhythm to it, which is so important because on a very general level, we are watching something that is obviously something that is elevated beyond reality. It is not a it's not a real film. It is not a realistic film. It is a hyper realistic film. It is a super world. This is a world that is not like the one that we inhabit in our daily lives. This is something that is other than that, something more fantastical, more supernatural, if you will. That seems to be governed by its own set of the laws of physics, which I think is wonderful, because that's one of the beautiful things about cinema, is that cinema elevates the real into the hyper real, and that becomes more of a joy when you have that kind of hyper-reality being the context of the story, which deals with characters that are themselves bigger than life, that are mythical, that are heroic, that are legends. And I think we have legendary characters, not only with the Chow Yun-fat character, the killer, who is a legend and an icon, but you also have the wonderful Inspector Lee, the Danny Lee character. So these two are the icons. These are the legends of the film. And of course, they, I think, in their own respective ways, gain legendary status as the film progresses. Not only do we see them perform almost inhuman, acrobatic-like skill with respect to shootouts and gunfare, but we also see them act out in a way that creates a sense of legend behind them in their wake. Not only do we see the Chow Yun-fat character and the way he progresses and his character arc ends, but we also see Inspector Lee's character and how he develops and ends up as a character by the film's end. So it's really quite a momentous thing to see these two icons in a film that is so stylized that it helps to elevate their mythic status by virtue of the film's hyper-realized visual style. Speaking of the characters, of course, this leads into a really interesting facet of this film, I think, which is the film is so highly structured and it's so symmetrical. And it's symmetrical, I think, in many ways, which I think is really fascinating. So the first way I think it's symmetrical is in terms of, let's say, its narrative. So it has a how should I say, in its terms of its characterizations. So I mentioned before that we have the two icons here. So the good guy and the bad, or the good guy and the bad guy, so to speak. So the police and the killer. So Inspector Lee, Danny Lee's character on the one hand, and the killer, John, or Chow Yun-fat's character on the other. And it's wonderful because they are obviously very similar to each other, and they have certain similar character traits. They are both very determined. They are both, they seem to be a bit loner types. They are very singularly focused. They are very expertly skilled in terms of their ability to shoot, and they are also antagonistic towards one another, which is perfect. It's the perfect mirror relationship, and of course that relationship develops into something quite endearing as the film reaches its climax and denouement. So you have this parallel structure of these characters that are on a collision course, but that collision course becomes something that blossoms into something really interesting by the film's end. And this is a wonderful symmetrical relationship here, which is made even more symmetrical by the fact that each has his own mentor figure. So we have the Inspector Lee character having his own mentor figure or elderly figure in the form of the Sergeant Chang, or Randy Chang, and then the Chow Yun-fat character, of course, having his own mentor or friend in the form of Sydney, who is the liaison between Chow Yun-fat and the triads. So this is a really wonderful narrative symmetry, which leads into my next point, which is not only is there narrative symmetry, but there's also a nice visual symmetry in the film itself. So you have these characters that are on a collision course, and when they do meet, there's, of course, for example, the iconic scene when they're in Jenny's apartment, and by this time she has very poor eyesight, so she cannot see these two characters, but we see them, with their guns pointed at each other, and they're trying to act out this sort of ruse. They don't want to give themselves away lest they disappoint Jenny or lest they put her in a panic. So they are both concerned about this young woman, and yet we see them pointing guns at each other. So it's a lovely visual, symmetrical, balanced image that we have of these two men pointing guns at each other with their arms straight. in that wonderful John Woo way. And you have this lovely balance in the screen. And of course, they are enemies at this point. But once the film kicks into its final act, into really high gear, and they become partners, then we see a lovely balance. Chow Yun-fat on one side of the screen looking this way, and Inspector Lee on the other side of the screen looking the other way. And there's a lovely balance between how these two characters are portrayed, and they are portrayed very similarly by John Woo's loving camera. There's a wonderful bit at the end when they're being ambushed at the church, and just as they're going to do their final heroic act, they look at each other and they bond. And there's that wonderful moment when Chow Yun-fat is looking and he smiles, and the film freezes, and then we look again at Inspector Lee and he's smiling, and then the film freezes on him. So we've got these wonderful freeze frame images of them. They're looking at each other. The film frame is balanced, and they are one. And so it's just a wonderful visual symmetry that we're having here as well, in terms of the way that these characters are being treated by John Woo's camera. But what's also interesting, I think, as well, is that there is also, I would say, a kind of, how shall I put it, a kind of moral symmetry, or symmetry that's based on morality. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, this is going into specifics of the narrative. So what I like is that there is a real sense of cause and effect. An act leads to consequences. So if something happens here, that leads to something happening here. And that's not just in terms of A leading to B, but it's also in terms of an act has certain consequences, and that leads into a kind of this idea almost of doing a bad deed will mean that something bad will happen to you. This sort of thing where if you do something bad or do something wrong, it'll wrong you in the end. And so what do I mean by this? So the whole arc of the film is basically the killer, Chow Yun-fat's character, John, or Ah John. He's trying to make amends for the act that he committed towards the beginning of the film. Namely, he's carrying out this hit, and along the way, he's trying to protect himself. He gets shot in the back, but then he retaliates, and as he retaliates, you remember, he fires the gun right in front of the face of Jenny. And so it blinds her, it injures her, it causes her eyes to become damaged, perhaps permanently, we don't know. And so this causes the chain reaction of the film's plot. Namely, he is trying now to make amends. He's trying to help her. He is trying to do what he can for her. And then there comes a point where he is trying to get enough money in order to pay for an operation which might hopefully restore her eyesight. So it's a really interesting plot dynamic that's going on here, but the notion of, like, as I say, a moral symmetry, or cause and effect, or act leads to consequence, is it's great here, because we have the Chow Yun-fat's character's act, which is namely him causing the blindness of this girl, of Jenny. Right, so the cause. So we have John's act of shooting the gun. So that's the cause, and then the effect is the blindness of the girl. And so then that leads to this idea of the blindness of the girl. Then leads to him, John, wanting to help her, and then that leads into him wanting to help her, so that he goes into one last job, and he wants to get paid a certain amount of money, but he ends up being double-crossed by the mafia, because they don't want to pay him. And so then that leads to the tension and the battles between him and the mafia, which then ends up leading to his ultimate demise, right? And so therefore, so it's interesting, because we have the first cause and effect, namely John's, carrying out of this hit at the beginning causing the blindness of Jenny. Then we have the blindness of Jenny being the cause of Chow Yun-fat's trying to redeem himself. That's the effect. And then we have that being the cause of him trying to carry out one more act in order to save Jenny, and then that leads to the battle with the mafia, and it's that cause, that final cause, his battle with the mafia, that leads to his demise, and his demise mirrors exactly the initial cause that started this chain reaction to begin with, namely the blinding of Jenny, which is such a fascinating thing because it starts out with the blinding of Jenny as being the initial cause, and we have this chain reaction of cause and event, of causal relationship, cause event, cause event, cause event, that finally leads to the final ultimate event of John and him dying with, of course, the most obviously wonderful symbolic thing, namely him being blinded, and then he dies alone. Right? So we have the initial cause leading to the ultimate effect being one and the same, mirror image of each other. Wonderful sort of moral symmetry that occurs in this film. It's very rich, and it's very it's labyrinthine, perhaps. Well, not labyrinthine. It's quite structured. And if we step back and we think, if we listen, for example, to the commentary that's available on this release, we understand that John Woo is religious, and that probably inspired him to introduce the Christian imagery, this idea of the church. We don't necessarily have characters that are directly religious per se, but we do have interactions where there is some discussion about God, and of course there's this idea of a certain morality, doing good deeds versus doing bad deeds, and if one does a bad deed, then one will go punished. So we have ultimately the Chow Yun-fat character doing a bad deed, which ultimately is punished in a way that mirrors the bad deed that he initially committed, which is, again, just a wonderful, wonderful structure. And it's wonderful too. I mean, now that I think about it, right, because the film begins in a church and it ends in a church. So then we have this wonderful, this capping off of this moral structure that is just perhaps augmented by the fact that we begin in a church and we end in a church. So one act of morality or immorality leads to the result, namely the same condition is imposed upon that person which initially committed that act to begin with. This is a wonderful, rich film. It has so many layers, I think, that I think are so deserving of repeat viewings, and this has a lot of sensitivity. It is certainly quite violent, and it is it doesn't shy away from that, and it is very heavily stylized. There's that wonderful, I think one of my favorite moments ever is in the beginning with Chow Yun-fat, and he's killing all these guys, and one guy's about to kill him, and there's a gun on the table, so there's a slow motion shot of Chow Yun-fat kicking the table, and it just flips the gun and just catches it in midair and shoots the guy. It's just wonderful ballet style. It's almost like martial arts. There's so many things infused in this film. It's like, if I were to think of other Criterion Collection films to compare it, it's like Le Samurai meets A Touch of Zen meets City Lights. If you add these three films together, you get The Killer. And it's just a marvel in terms of its visual treats and in terms of its over-the-top. It's unabashedly over-the-top. I mean, one of the things I really love is that there's a moment early on where we see Inspector Lee looking at his gun, and he's got the bullets And we see that there is a limited number of bullets, like 6 bullets or something, but that go into the chamber. And this is this is very, I think, tongue-in-cheek perhaps, because later on, of course, we see the gun battles, and they're shooting their guns as though the number of bullets in the chamber is limitless. So the fact that we see him counting or looking at the finite number of bullets at the beginning is almost laughable in a very sincerely earnest way, because by the film's conclusion, these people are just shooting endlessly, which is wonderful. It's almost like what's a good way of putting it? It's like the law of non-diminishing returns. It's quite wonderful. I mean, and that's part of the style that John Woo employs, and we accept it because by this point we are trusting of John Woo, the director, and his wonderful visual style. Just one of those iconic films, and one of those films I think everyone should watch at least once. John Woo's The Killer, one of the greats in the Criterion Collection. Hopefully one of these days it'll come back. It's OOP, unfortunately, and it's one of those really expensive OOP titles. So who knows? One day, I hope it comes back. But in the meantime, you don't have to get the Criterion Collection release, of course. I'm sure there are other releases that are perfectly serviceable in watching this film. I mean, it's more important to watch the film, I would say, than having the Criterion Collection release. As much as I love the Criterion Collection, of course, and I'm all for getting all the releases from the Criterion Collection, I think ultimately it's about the film, is it not? So if you can get your hands on the release by the Criterion Collection, more power to you. Just make sure that it's not a bootleg, and if you can't, just make sure you see it by other means, and let's enjoy more John Woo films. Okay, so let me end right there, and that was spine number 8, John Woo's The Killer. Next time I will be talking about spine number 9. This is also filmed by John Woo, is called Hard Boiled. Until we meet again, my friends, please be well and take care. Cheers.